I'm often being asked on how I develop new roasting profiles for the Aillio Bullet. So if I have a new bean, on how I find the right profile for this particular bean. This is a super interesting but also quite broad topic, a topic that we have in detail covered in the Aillio Bullet Masterclass. And what you see right now is a short extract from the Masterclass, and it's the extract where we ask ourselves the first and most important questions that start when you want to develop a roasting profile for the particular bean. And if you have answered all these questions, then you have the most important decisions already taken, and it will be quite easy for you to find the right profile. By the way, the Aillio Bullet Masterclass is an online course on the Aillio Bullet. It comprises more than 4.5 hour content, all about the technique of the machine, how it's working, but we also deep dive into roasting in general, and then always do a hands-on approach where we directly talk about the Aillio Bullet and how to develop then the according profiles for the Aillio Bullet. So that after having done the Masterclass, you know precisely how to get the best out of this machine. If this is something for you, then have a look at the Aillio Bullet Masterclass. You find all information right here or also down there in the description. But now let's start with the basic questions to develop a roasting profile for the Aillio Bullet. When you're going to develop a particular profile, then there are some questions that you can ask yourself. And the first one and the most important one is, what drink do I want to create? And this is really super important if you start. So don't start with just doing anything, or don't just start with any beans. Really think about what drink do you want to create. You want to create a cold brew which has a lot of fruity aspects and is really refreshing. Do you want to roast a contemporary light filter roast with some floral aspects? Do you want to create a typical Italian espresso or a cappuccino, a more fruity or a more chocolatey cappuccino? And depending on what drink you want to create, you in first instance choose the appropriate bean, a bean that is then really bringing out these aspects. And we're going to have a look at green coffee a bit more in detail later, but they're just beans that, for example, bring out more chocolatey flavors. On the other hand, there are beans that are bringing from nature more acidity or more fruity aspects. So choose the right beans or the right blend of beans. And then when you have chosen a bean, you are going to think about what is in the bean. Is there some acidity? Is there some sweetness in it? Or are there more full-bodied or savory aspects in the beans that I want to highlight, or some herbal aspects, or some nutty or chocolatey aspects? So what is in the bean and what do I want to highlight in order to achieve the drink that I want to create? And based on this question, you then decide how light or dark you're going to roast the coffee. And you have seen that before. So the lighter roasts have more terroir, they have more acidity. At a particular point, also a bit more sweetness. Darker roasts have more body. They then have more bitterness also, but they have also more roasty flavors, which a lot of people like, and also less acidity. So you're going to define how light or dark you're going to roast. And when you have defined this, you think about how fast or slow do I want to roast. Do I want to do a faster roast or a little bit a slower roast in order to achieve the flavors I'm going to look for? As you have seen before, with faster roast, you have more these floral aspects. With slower roast, you have a bit more this herbal or this caramelized aspects and more body in the roast. And when you have defined this, you can then check, is there any risk of scorching or tipping in the profile I want? Because usually, especially in this contemporary specialty coffee roasting that we are doing, we usually look for a roast profile that is as fast as possible. But then if you're doing this fast roast, you still have to not be too fast in order to avoid scorching or tipping in the beans. And then last but not least, you need also to check that you are going to reduce the risk of scorching or tipping, which is particularly important if you do fast roasts, especially fast roasts that a lot of people are doing. To be fast, but not too fast and not too hot in order to prevent having these scorched or tipped roasting defects we talked about before. So then decisions you are going to take, first of course, the choice of beans you want to have, then the amount of beans you're putting in the roaster. The thermodynamic, depending on the amount of beans, is different. We are going to have a look at this then in the next part of this presentation. And decisions you are taking, particularly on your machine, the preheat temperature, the heat settings, the fan settings, and the drum settings. But before we have a look at these decisions in detail, there are some rules or some aspects that often applies and that might give you an indication in order to define a roasting profile that is suitable for you. So if you have more development time, you have usually less acidity. If you have less development time, you have a bit more acidity. If you reach at the end a higher end temperature, you have a darker color, you have more roasty notes, and you have also less sweetness because on one hand the sugars have been burned, and on the other hand you have then bitterness increasing, and bitterness is actually then reducing the perception of sweetness in the coffee. And therefore, on the other hand, if you have a lower end temperature, you have a bit lighter color, less roast notes, more sweetness in the coffee. When you then not look at the development time, but at the time from beginning of the roast until first crack, as a rule of thumb, you can say if you have longer time to first crack, you have more savoriness and you have less floral notes. If you have a longer time to first crack, you have also more sugar browning notes. And if you have a lower time until first crack, you have more pronounced these floral notes, which you might look for example, in a filter roast. And then looking at the charge temperature, you are really then trying to find a suitable charge temperature for your roast, because if it's too high, you have a risk of scorching, and this is actually also then depending on the bean. So we are going to talk a little bit later on the density of the bean, but just for you to know, if you have a denser bean, then usually it's a bit more resistant to this roasting defect of scorching, while beans with a lower density are a bit more on the risk of having scorching. That's why if you have harder beans with a higher density, you can usually go a little bit higher in charge temperature because you have a lower risk of scorching. And if you have softer beans, then you need to be quite careful with the charge temperature. But don't put it too low on the other hand, because then if you have a too low temperature, you have a higher risk of baking, because the roast can be then just a bit too long because it has not enough momentum. So if you have at any part in your roast, this can happen at the beginning, but also around first crack or in the development phase, not enough momentum and the roast is getting too long, then you have a risk of baking the coffee, which is then leading to this really unpleasant and not nice flavors. If you have too high momentum, I mean, you want to have a nice momentum, but if it's too high, if you're too fast, then you have this risk of tipping. This is also then depending on the beans. Also, if you have harder beans with higher density, they are a bit more resistant to tipping as well. But nevertheless, just take care to find a momentum which is fast enough for the bean, but then also not too fast. I hope this video was helpful for you. As said, this was a short extract from the Aillio Bullet Masterclass, which is an online course on the Aillio Bullet, where in more than 4.5 hours we talk about everything related to the Aillio Bullet, how it's working, all its functions, but we're also talking about roasting in general, and then always connected with a hands-on approach on how to do all the settings on the Aillio Bullet directly, so that after having done the Masterclass, you know precisely how to get the best out of this machine. If this is of interest to you, then have a look at it. You find the link to it right here or in the description. And if the Aillio Bullet in general is something that is of interest to you, then have a look at our website where you find all the details about it. You find it on roasttravels.com.